Hello again, and welcome to another Here's a Storm Quick Tip. Today I wanted to briefly go over the tank metagame and how it's shifted over the past 6 months or so, basically since the end of CCL. As you can see, there are two windows up. One is my tank tiers for what I would consider higher tier play, in other words, Division A and above, also somewhat Division B, and then there's Division C and below. And if you don't play NGS or know what that means, it means this is generally where Platinum is the overall level of play. Usually better because they practice and they play with comms. You know, it's a coordinated game, but that is the general level of skill. And then this one is generally everyone is masters or close to masters in this division. And so that is the difference between the two. And so, as a result, some of these are in different places than they would be, although the majority haven't shifted. So, to start off with, there may be a little bit of argument about Diablo being up here, and that's primarily because he's the best tank in a vacuum, because he's hard to kill. He is 3 or 4 different builds, and so it's really hard to outright counter Diablo because, for example, if you just try and hard counter him when he goes in, he can just go flame build and poke and do a lot of annoying things. And with Soul Shield, it's still very difficult to kill a Diablo like that. And what that means is also he becomes more of a counter engage tank, which he's still very good at. And so the other thing with Diablo is he has one of the best uh, heroic and non heroic engages in the game. And so very few tanks have both of those. And so when you combine all that, he's just incredibly good. Now, the counter argument is it's easier to draft counters to Diablo, but I find that percent damage is being drafted by most teams in general because you have to be prepared for a late, like a last pick, not Diablo, Deathwing, which has made the rounds a lot and is one of the more annoying things. So if you don't have 80% damage in your draft anyway, um, and the opponents haven't picked a tank, yeah, obviously you got to worry about Diablo, but you also got to worry about like Deathwing or even Leoric. Um, so I don't find that a particularly like great argument anymore. But yeah, in general, it's slightly easier to counter Diablo than say Johanna, for example, which is the other reason Johanna's up here. She's arguably the only tank that has no hard counters against her, and so as a result, she basically wins or breaks even with every other tank matchup in the game, like tank v tank, and so that's why she's up here. And the other reason is because she's the only high tier tank with really good wave clear by default. You don't really have to talent into anything. Her wave clear is just good with her normal buttons. And then combine that with Blessed Shield, which is her best, heroic engage, and arguably one of the best engages in the game. And then, yeah, that is why she's up here. The reason I've listed her 3 times is one was an accident. I just forgot to remove her from here, and because I was having an argument over whether on on Infernal Shrines, obviously she's very good, and that's why she's in here. Even if you don't think she's that much better than the other tanks to be worth putting up here, she'd still end up in A tier. She'd still be very good. But on maps where she doesn't, not Tomb, not Shrines, maybe you drop her a little bit because she's not as good because the wave clear doesn't make as big a difference. But again, this is really semantics. Basically, I think in higher tier games, you're always going to see her as a top 3 tank unless she's nerfed again in some way. I think the biggest change is Mei. Mei got a buff to Ice Wall, and as a result, that fixed her biggest problem, which was her inconsistent engage. Ice Wall, for you, if you didn't know, is now down to 50 seconds, which means you can now throw it out to look for picks. And if you miss one, not only will it probably be up before you take a fight, but it's basically up all the time. It's almost not worth keeping track of the cooldown because 50 seconds is so low. It's up almost any time in the late game. The other reason is because people have just gotten better using Ice Wall. People made the argument, oh, you can just walk out of it, but what happened is people are using it more as an actual wall now, so you can split teams with Ice Wall. And the other thing is people are getting better with the angles. Cursed Hollow is a really good example of a ice wall friendly map where if you try and take boss, ice wall is a very good way to steal boss or win a boss invade. It's also very good in camps and about half the tribute spawns, where if you put an ice wall down in a corridor, it will cover nearly the entire corridor. So if you're a big hitbox hero, you may not actually be able to avoid it. And even if you do, you may get stuck in such a way that you're very limited where you can move. And it's almost as good as freezing them in that case. Besides that, Mei has always had okay wave clear, really amazing survivability, and has a lot of utility in her normal buttons. She has a good slow, she has a blind, she gives armor to her teammates if you go skating around 7, and just in general, she's very difficult to kill and very annoying to get away from. She's probably the best counter-engaged tank in the game, and I think now that people know that and aren't as reliant... So the problem with Avalanche was you had to basically use all your buttons to get in to set it up, and that wasn't consistent against good teams and good players because they would see it and maneuver out of the way or CC you during the startup of Avalanche. And so now with Ice Wall, that's no longer a factor. You have an engage that's not tied to your other buttons. Uther, in general, really good. He's basically a better Tyrael in the current meta because Divine Shield just not only does it enable hyper carries, but it also saves people when very little else will. And right now is a metagame where you can definitely get locked down and deleted instantly if you aren't careful, if you get knocked out of position. Medallion kind of mitigated that for a while, but obviously without Medallion, you can definitely still get locked down and explode in less than 3 seconds if you're not careful once we get to 20s and such. And so D-Shield's always good for that. He has good save buttons in general, and then the double stun at 16 is a really good pick tool. And why you don't even necessarily need Divine Storm. It's still a good heroic if you want to go that way, if you want to go full tank Uther, but like just having the double stun should be enough to kill people late game. He's also just a natural counter to annoying like slippery heroes like Zeratul, for example, or even Maiev, where if she goes in, you can kind of lock her down and just make her life really awful. You have to make them pick their spots, essentially. Murden's kind of like Diablo, and whereas like if you play him really well, he's a really good pick tank. He can jump in, jump out, set up stuns, set up kills, eat a ton of cooldowns from the enemy team and not die because of how Avatar works, and because of the armor off Dwarf Toss and other such. Like, you can talent into other things to make him even tankier, but yeah. Just in general, the biggest thing is just learning when to get out of fights and when to leap in or just walk in like mounted, for example, and look for an engage. And we already talked about Johanna. The rest of these are kind of all similar in the sense that they're all good, but they're good mostly into certain comps or certain situations. So that means their uses are a lot more narrow. Anub'arak, for example, really good into comps relying on mages or hyper carries because of Cocoon and because they can double CC. The downside is they can get poked to all hell and back. It's very hard to keep this guy alive against a good auto attacker. Like Raynor and Greymane really make Anub'arak's life miserable. Tychus, if he ever gets locked down, can also just shred this guy in a second. ETC is very similar. He's very squishy. He's relying on hitting buttons at the right time. If you do, he's one of the tankiest heroes in the game. But because that tankiness is situational and based on your ability to hit buttons, if you get caught out and say, for example, you get taunted by a Varian without hitting your buttons, you don't have your armor up, you can get killed before you have a chance to do anything. And so that makes it a lot sketchier than he used to be. Otherwise, he's a good generic do-everything tank, but with the mic check nerf, he doesn't have quite the same amazing peel as he had before. It's still very good, but he doesn't have it off cooldown all the time. Garrosh and Varian are the same thing. They're both really linear tanks that do one thing. They like set up kills. And so what happens is, against comps that can't really stop them from running up and setting up kills, they're going to dominate. And against comps that can, they're going to struggle. Leoric was drafted originally as a counter to the Johanna meta because he's not really affected by what Johanna does well. He provides wave clear. Spooky Hand is just a good damage tool in general and also slow tool. And then Entomb is like, again, a really good engage tool. And originally that was a big deal because it wasn't affected by Medallion. But even now, like, it remains like one of the best. And Buried Alive at 20 is really incredible. Always has been, but it's just a reminder of how good that tool is at securing kills. You can also go auto attack build instead of just going E build now. And auto attack build slaps. Like, if you can get consistent autos on people, you can do assassin levels of damage off Leoric post 16. So it's something to really be aware of. Finally, we go to C tier. And that is mostly, these tanks are all okay in very specific spots. Melganis is very good into no CC. Tyrael, like I said, is more of a support than a tank, kind of like Uther was. But right now, Tyrael not only requires too much effort to be good, but because people are playing on ping, especially like if you're playing on higher ping, it's really hard to get value out of him. Sanctification, teleport, and even shield timing all require a lot of reaction. And so even if you have the reactions necessary, the ping might not allow you to play Tyrael to a level you need to. Imperius got nerfed again. You can still play the 1v1 percentage build and be okay, but I really don't like him very much anymore in general. I don't think he puts out enough damage to make up for the fact that he's a one-note hero, which is he lands spears or he doesn't, and if he doesn't land spears or the enemy team has a way to counter it, like a Lucio or an Ana to just cleanse them every time they get speared, like Imperius doesn't do shit. He's just not a good hero. And Blaze is kind of the opposite, where it's like he does a lot of small stuff well, but just not as well as other heroes. He has wave clear, he has a stun, he has a save tool and bunker. He kind of suffers from Tyrael there in the sense of like, in terms of coordination, you can make both of these tanks work, but you really need your team to be on point with you. And so unless you're willing to practice these heroes a lot with your team, then you're probably not going to get enough value to justify them, essentially. He's still a good counter pick into certain matchups. I still think he's good in Diablo, for example, and he's good in other heroes like Maev. But yeah, his overall use is really low. And you even saw that in CCL, where he just didn't really perform when he did show up. And then finally, Arthas and Stitches are even narrower than these, so I would just say never pick them. You can if you build a comp around them, or you get the, God comp matchup against Arthas, where he can just walk in and make people's life miserable. But in general, these two are not worth playing. The main differences for Division C and below. In Division C and below, I would consider Mei unkillable. She's just Johanna with worse wave clear, but she survives forever and does more damage. And so I would say Mei is the first pick tank, always. Garrosh, also, people are way worse at killing him and step out of position a lot, which means you can run up mounted and get throws for free. Most of the requirements here, Diablo and Murden require a certain baseline level of skill to be good, and they also require a baseline follow-up from your team, which I don't always see. Varian's usually better than these heroes, but he's a worse hero than them, so this requires less work as a team, but these will give you better results if you're willing to practice together. Same thing here, Uther drops off. People don't play Uther. They burn cooldowns for no reason. They don't save stuns, etc. Anubrak and ETC, people don't play them well. Lower divisions for the most part. They get killed way too often, and so I don't see the value. Tyrael at that point becomes too big a liability. You can still play him if you're willing to put in the practice and build a comp around him where he's going to be consistently good. But otherwise, I would recommend ignoring him. I would not want to play Tyrael in games below. Honestly, even in Div A, I never really liked Tyrael, even though I played him to a fairly high, I think it was 70% win rate with my team in actual games. But he's just really hard to make work. I would say below Heroic, and if you have ping of over 40, he's really, really tough to play well. So just something to keep in mind. Alright, well, I hope this helps, and that's my general opinion on the tank tiers at the moment. Have a great day.